This tutorial is going to show you how to make this paint effect. As most of my other tutorials, it's a particle playground effect they're going to be creating. So I'm going to start a new composition, HD 720, 25 frames a second. Make the duration 6 seconds to start off with. And I'm going to need to have a solid layer in here, so I'm going to just put in a grey solid for now, doesn't matter what colour it is. And I want some text over the top of this to guide where I want my actual paint effect to be. Create some handwriting text. I'm using this Seago script font to do this, which I think is going to work very nicely. Just move this around a little bit to get it in the center of the frame. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this as a guide for where my particles need to go. So I'm going to actually fade the text a little bit so I can see through it. I'm going to lock that layer so I don't get mixed up about which layer I'm working on. This layer is going to be my particles layer, so I might as well rename that right now. And what we're going to do is just going to make a pen path that follows the shape of these letters, and we want to do it in the direction that we would write it if we were actually writing it. So I'm going to choose the pen tool. I'm going to start up here. It's a bit tricky to do live, but you don't have to be absolutely spot on with where you put the pen, but I want to put in a bit of curve as we go so it looks a bit more like the natural flow of handwriting. I always think that one of the biggest improvements you can make to anything that you do in After Effects is learning how to use this pen tool properly. So, whoops, that's not what I want. You're going to have to kind of loop back around the way you would write this if you're doing like handwriting. So you can always go back and adjust it, but I'm just trying to not have to do that. So when you finish this main part of the writing, there's going to be a couple of places where you need to go back and dot the I's and cross the T's. Literally in this case. So you just actually continue with the path as if you were doing that. I want to make sure I've got points where I start and end this dot. I'm just going to make the path go around a little circle to follow the dot over the I, and just get it in the right direction down here. Point at the start, but that's not working very well, so I have to be slightly off. That's okay, it just means that my T stroke is going to be a bit longer. So that's done. Looks a bit messy right now, but that's basically what we want to have. So at this stage we have a mask in the particles layer, and this mask path shape is going to be what's going to drive our particles. So I actually don't need this paint layer anymore. I'm going to keep it there just in case I need to redo anything again, but I'm just going to hide it for now. So just working the particles layer, I'm going to apply my particle playground effect. So simulation, particle playground. Of course the layer disappears when we do that. And what I want to do is I want to make the cannon effect follow this path, firing particles as it goes. So let's just straight off make some changes. I don't want my particles to fall according to gravity, so let's fix that first. So we go Effects, Particles from, None. And if I just play this right now, we've got a stream of particles going up. I don't want my particles really to move, but I want some randomness in them. So let's just adjust the cannon a little bit to get what we want. First thing is I'm going to increase the barrel radius to be about the width of my paint stroke. So maybe about 10. Okay. And the velocity I'm going to reduce to nothing. And random spread, nothing. So now we're just going to get particles not moving. Okay, but of course they will move because we're going to move where the particles are appearing. Okay, so I need to change this position to be wherever it should be on this path. So the trick to doing this is to find your path, find its shape, and then paste the shape into the position parameter of the effect. So I'm just going to give this a bit more space here. So here's the mask and there's the shape. Here's the effects, particle playground, cannon, and here's the position. So I'm going to Control C on the path, Control V on the position. So select that, Control C, select the position, Control V. And then you get this keyframe representation of all the positions on the path that we have, which is very neat. And it's basically going to be too short here, but what you can see is that the particles are now moving along my mask path. Okay, now I want this to last longer. I want it to last about 5 seconds rather than the amount of time it does. But I'm actually going to be changing the timing on in a couple of places. So I'm going to actually spread it at first to 6 seconds. So in order to spread this, you notice that all these keyframes in the middle are round dots. Now these are roving keyframes, so all you need to do to spread out the path is actually just move one of the ends of the path. Sorry, keyframes. Move one of the keyframes at the end, the diamond-shaped keyframes. So if I take this one and move it, you notice that all the other keyframes are going to stretch out. So now my particle system is going to be moving much slower. And you can see it travels along the path. So if we just preview that for a moment, it won't take very long because it's very few particles, but if we preview this, see what you've got. There's a couple of things we need to do. We might want to have more particles or bigger particles so it's more filled in. I'm going to go with more particles at first, so let's increase my particle rate, particles per second, from 60, let's make it 200. See what that looks like. Then the other thing that I want to do is I want it to stop from firing particles between the dot and the I and the cross on the T. I don't want those trails. So let's see how we can do that. So if I open up the particles and show my keyframes again, so press U on the layer to show all the keyframes, what I want to do is I want to find those keyframes where I should be switching off the particles. So at this keyframe the particles should be off, and you can see there's this little dot here which is one of my roving keyframes. Now if I actually move this dot, it will become a non-roving keyframe. Everything else will stay the same. If I move it just a touch, you see this now becomes a diamond keyframe. I'm going to look for my next position where I want particles to appear. It's going to be this one here. So I'm also going to move that one a little bit. Okay. Now what I can do is I can move these keyframes, these two diamonds that I've just created, much closer together, so that the time taken to move from there to there is only a couple of frames. Just a little pause to allow you to imagine that the hand doing the writing is moving. So to do this, I'm going to select these two keyframes, these two diamonds at the end, and move them closer together. Like that. Maybe a little bit further apart, so we can believe that this. So you notice that that travels very fast now, then slows back down, and then the end of this little dot here is going to be this keyframe here, which I'm also going to move. I actually might want it to fill in that little dot a little bit more. It's kind of hardly there at the moment, so to allow it to spend more time, I could actually take these two keyframes. So this area in here is the time when it's actually painting this dot. So if I move these further apart, it's going to take a little bit longer to paint the dot. It's going to be a bit more filled in. Okay. Then between this keyframe and this second keyframe here, again it should be moving very fast. So if I move this one a little bit and select these two, I can pull these closer to where the dot is painted. So, a bit hard to see, but and then it's just actually going to carry on for the rest of my composition, not moving, so painting a big solid lump of dots at the end of the T, which I'll fix in a minute also. So I actually want it to stop completely in between a couple of places. But let's just preview what we've got first and see. So that looks nice to me. That looks like a hand jumping over to paint the dot and then painting the stroke on the T. So let's just actually stop it from making particles while it's moving. So obviously what we want to do is keyframe the particles per second. So at this frame it's still making particles, at this frame it's not. So let's just go here and add my first key for particles per second here. And I want to have one at the very beginning because I may actually want to have a pause before it starts creating keys. So I'm actually I want to show that it's not showing my particles per second keyframes in here at the moment. I'm just going to press U on the keyboard twice. So now you can see here's my particles per second. I'm going to add a keyframe here just by clicking in this little keyframe dot. So that's my start keys. And if I move everything, I can add a 0 key before that to stop it from making particles before I want it to start. So it goes full speed all the way through the stroke up to here. Then I want it to stop on this keyframe, so just set my particles per second to 0. Then I want it to start again when it gets to this keyframe. So I want to make sure it doesn't make any before that keyframe. So I could actually change my keys here to the square type, but I'm just going to key everything. So make another 0 key there. Is where I wanted to start painting. So push this back up to 200. I'm going to paint in some particles there until it gets to here. So key again. That's going to be another 200 key. And then it doesn't paint anything till it gets here, so that's going to be 0. So the one before should be 0, so I'm just going to move this back. That goes back up to 200 again. So it's not making any particles on this part of the stroke and no particles on this part of the stroke, but then it starts again. Once we get to the end, to make one more 200 keyframe, then go one frame further on after it should be finished. If you wanted a little bit more of a dot at the end, you could actually go a couple of frames past, just to make it a little bit more solid when you finish the stroke. So you can actually move that last keyframe there and then switch off here. So particles per second, 0 for the last time. So I do actually want it to have a little bit of a pause before we start making particles at the beginning. So let's just take all my keyframes here. I've selected everything, both layers, and just give it a few frames before we start making particles. Now it's actually going to make particles all the way through. So let's go the frame before we start moving along the path. Set my particles per second to 0. There's going to be no particles until it gets to this frame, and it's going to paint. So let's preview that. Okay, that's pretty much what we want. So I'm going to move my time slider so I can see part way through the painting. I'm going to change a few things. I'm going to change my particle radius to maybe, I don't know, 4. Okay. This path is starting to bother me. I could either delete it, I don't need it anymore, or we can just tell it not to show paths by toggling the mask and shape path visibility here. So I'll do that just in case we need to go back to it, but we shouldn't need to. So I'm just going to switch that off for now. The only thing is you need to remember that you switched off if you're drawing any more paths for anything else. So you can actually delete the path. You don't need it, and you don't need the pen path anymore. So I've made my particles a little bit bigger, particle radius 4. I'm going to add a few effects now to this to actually make it look a bit more like blobby paint. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blur this. And while I'm doing this, what you need to remember is we're painting against transparent, not against black. So the black is just the background color of the composition. Okay, so I'm going to add a fast blur effect to this. I'm going to blur it enough that it becomes blobby looking, like that. And then I want to sharpen this up again. I want it to have this soft edge to it now, but sharp. So you might not understand what I mean, but you'll see when I do it. So I'm going to add in an effect, color correction, levels, and a trick that I kind of changed my life when I learned it is that you can actually use levels for alpha as well as for RGB, red, green, blue. So I'm going to choose alpha here. I'm going to adjust the alpha levels, and by adjusting the histogram here I can turn this soft edge back into a sharp edge, but it's now got the softness from the fast blur. So you can see how that makes a kind of a nice blobby paint effect. So if you just want a very kind of graphic paint effect, that's already very nice, so you get this. It's still quite fast to do. You can see that my previewing is actual speed. And if at the end you find there's a couple of places where there are gaps, you've got a couple of things you could do. You could increase the number of particles per second. You could increase the barrel radius so you're getting a bit more. Or you could just decide that actually that looks quite nice. It looks quite random and I don't mind it at all. One other thing you could do is actually just change where your threshold is so your paint's a bit thicker. Also quite a nice thing to be able to do. So I'll go with a bit thicker paint for now. Okay, but if I want this to look like blobby paint, like thick paint, now I'm going to add a couple more things. The first thing you can add, remember that this is an alpha outline, very nice for adding it over the top of other things. In fact, let's add it over something else. I'm just going to take that grey solid that we made before for the particles and drop it in again underneath so we can see a few other things as we go. So going back to the particles layer, going back to the effect controls, I'm going to add in effect, perspective. I'm going to use bevel alpha. So we'll bevel the edge of the alpha. So now you see a sort of slight beveled edge around the paint to give it a little bit of thickness. You can increase the thickness by dragging on this edge thickness value. So I want to make it look very blobby, so let's increase this, and you can increase how much highlight there is. I'm going to go a bit over the top for something that I'm going to do next. But if all you want is this kind of angled bevel, again, looks quite nice like this. But there's a couple more steps we can do. So again, I'm going to find a point somewhere in the middle. So if I want this to look like soft blobby paint, I can add in some more blur and some more effects. It gets a bit one on top of another, but you can see it's working quite fast. So it's not that intensive to do this. So effect, blur and sharpen. This time I'm going to choose a channel blur because I don't actually want to blur my alpha. I want to keep the sharp edge, but I can adjust my red, green and blue blurs, and if you want a very plasticky feel, you just in the same amount. And this is where you might decide that you haven't got enough highlight around the edge, so you could increase the amount of light in the bevel alpha. So that looks quite nice, but now I'm getting this very slight edge which I don't really want, coming from the blurring of the edge of the colours. So I just want to bring in the edge just a very slight amount. So to do that I'm just going to add a matte choker effect on top of this one. So matte choker, and I think that the default settings for this work fine. I could actually bring it in a bit further, play around with the effects to get what I want. And the final thing that might make this look like a cool effect is to put on some drop shadow underneath the effect. So again, effect, perspective, drop shadow. Choose your direction how you want it, choose your distance how you want it. Give it a little bit of softness if you want it. Here's our first incarnation of our paint effect. I say first incarnation because this is quite nice, but the paint is very static. It doesn't look very alive. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to go back to our particle system and show you how we can make the paint appear to spread a little bit, as paint would do as it's painted on. So right now it's very static as it's painted. So having got all these effects on the layer that make this nice blobby effect, I'm going to switch them all back off again and go back to working on the particle system to improve on the way the particles get put on the paper. Okay, so I'm just going to drag over all my effects, switch them back off again. And I'm going to do some things that seem like a bad idea when we first do them. So what I'm going to do is, I don't want the particles to have any width at all when they're created, so I'm going to drag my barrel radius down to 0. Typing is easier. And instead of them being just created and not move at all, I actually want them to move away from wherever they're created. I want them to move randomly in any direction, so I'm going to increase my direction random spread to 360. I'm going to give it a velocity of about 20 and a velocity random spread maybe about 15. Don't know, we might change this later, but we'll see how it goes. And now it looks like my paint effect is pretty much destroyed. If I preview this, the particles are just going to keep spreading out. So the speed of spreading I quite like, but what I want them to do is I want them to stop moving a little bit after they're created. So this again is a neat trick. How do I make them stop their movement? Move a little bit and then stop. So this one puzzles a lot of people, how you control this particle and make them slow down. In fact, for a while I thought you couldn't do it, but you can. So I'm going to show you how. We're going to use the persistent property mapper to do this. And the thing that we're going to set in the persistent property mapper, well, first thing is we don't actually need anything in the layer, anything particular in the layer that we use as a map, but we have to have something in this setting for the persistent properties to be applied. So I'm just going to use the the particles layer itself as my layer. Okay, and then it doesn't matter which one of these I use to do what we're going to do, so I'm just going to use map red 2. I only want to do one thing, which is to stop the particles moving. And the thing that we use to stop the particles moving is kinetic friction. And this needs, if anybody can explain how these numbers actually work, because I don't understand, but it needs very, very low values. And I'm going to put the same 0.01 value in both settings, and you'll see that that actually pretty much stops the particles straight away. They move very, very slightly when they're first created, if you watch as the particle is created. Now you can play around with this value until you get what you want, but it takes a long time to say, okay, I want it to move for half a second and then stop. So if I want these particles to move for maybe, I don't know, actually probably less than half a second, say I want them to move for about 0.4 of a second and stop, I can use the particle's age to decide when this kinetic friction is applied. So I'm going to open out this effects rollout here. I'm going to use older, younger than, and if I want them to slow down and stop completely by, well, let's make it a little bit longer so you can see the effect, so maybe by 0.6. I'm actually going to use older, younger than halfway through the time that I want them to take to stop. So I'm going to use 0.3. Then I want to age feather this amount by the entire range. So, but the entire range is 0.6. 0.6. That means it's going to be completely unaffected at 0 when they're created and completely affected at 0.6. Now they're actually going to appear to stop before they get to here because, well, kinetic friction is quite a heavy effect. But what you can see is they do spread out a little bit and then stop. If you want them to spread more, you could actually either give it a longer time, but if you want them to spread more and take the same time, you could increase the velocity. If you want them to spread less, you could decrease the velocity. So it gives you a lot of control over exactly what you get. So I want to show you another trick here, because actually what I would like now is that there's a bit more detail in this paint. But I've already keyed all my how many particles per second and all this, and if I want more detail, what I really need to do is make the particles smaller but have more of them. So I'm going to show you another neat way to go about this without having to go through all your keyframes and change all your 200 particles per second to, I don't know, 4 times as many or something. So again, I'm going to go back to my Canon and I'm going to halve the size of my particles. So now it's not really going to be enough to get the paint filled in, so I need a lot more particles. I've already keyframed this. There's a lot of keyframes in this layer. I don't want to have to go through all of them and redo them. So what I can do is actually use an expression to multiply whatever number is in here. You remember that when there's none, it's 0. So multiplying 0 by a number is always going to be 0 anyway. So if I alternate click on here, it gives me an expression which is basically this keyframed number. If I want more than this number by a factor of, say, 4, I can just say times 4. Now the actual number it's going to use is whatever is keyframed multiplied by 4. So you can see that where it's keyframed now I have 800 in here. I didn't have to go back and do any of my keyframes. When it's 0, it's still 0. But I've got a lot more particles. And like I say, I want this to be a bit more random, so maybe I'm just going to increase the velocity a little bit. So let's try decreasing the velocity a little bit, counterintuitively, but increasing the random spread to say 25. So you'll get a stronger central area because the velocity is decreased, but this random spread shows how far away from that central stroke they're allowed to move. So let's have a look at how that looks. It's taking a little bit longer to preview, but it's still not bad. So that kind of randomness of the particles is about what I want. This is going to be a very nice kind of random paint stroke here. So having done this, I'm going to put my time slide about part way through so I can judge how it evolves over time. And I'm going to go back to my other effects, and I'll need to adjust them because the amount of blur was based on a bigger particle. So I'm going to go through them one at a time, the same way we just did, to change some of these things. So I'm going to blur a lot less, maybe only about 5 or 6. Actually, let's try about 7. That looks about right to me. So that will work. Let's go back to our levels. And again, this can be, how blobby do you want it? Well, about there looks nice to me. In my bevel, again, the edge thickness will need to be less because, well, you can see why, because the paint is now got more detail in it. Channel blur, again, needs to be less, so let's just try 4. And you get some kind of nice effects. You probably saw this halfway through. If some of these numbers are different, blurred by different amounts, say if I blur the blue by more, I get this kind of very nice effect where the color kind of changes across the surface. So I kind of like that. I think I'm going to go with something like this. Maybe I'll differentiate the red as well. Let's make it about 6. So this is kind of quite nice. And my matte choker I shouldn't need to change. Maybe it's a bit too much now, so I'll go back to its default level of 75. Fine. My drop shadow, again, that's a matter of taste, so probably don't need to change that. So if I preview this now, if I was going to adjust this anymore, I probably want the paint to actually stop spreading a little bit quicker than it is doing, but it's quite nice, it's good enough. I'm just going to collapse this back down, and just for the sake of it, let's try this, just put it against the background and see how we can make it look. So I've got found a couple of nice free textures from a DeviantArt user called AGF81. So I'm going to just import this brick texture. I'm going to put it down here and just like hide my grey texture. If I wanted it to appear like this is actually paint on this wall, I would probably change a couple of things. First thing I would change is the actual colour of the paint. It looks too vivid. So let's just change the colour of the paint. To something far less defined. Maybe a bit brighter than that. And in my effects, I probably want to switch off the drop shadow for a second. I don't want this color difference in my channel blur, so I'd set those all the same, maybe 3 each. And I don't want a bright white highlight. The highlight is too bright, so in my bevel alpha I might drop down the highlight, but I might also actually choose a color for it that's not quite white, maybe a softer color like this. This looks a bit more like it's paint on the surface. And then my drop shadow, I want the shadow to look like it's actually on the surface rather than away from the surface as it is right now. So I would actually pull the softness right down, maybe just about 3 pixels. Move the distance back to the letter and look at the direction of where the shadows are on here. It's kind of more like, I don't know, about like that perhaps. If you're actually going for a paint against brick wall effect. And that does it for this tutorial.